Welcome to The World on Fire. I'm your host, Greg Wilpert. A prominent candidate for the presidency of Ecuador, Fernando Villavicencio, was assassinated on Wednesday, August 9th, just as he was leaving a campaign rally. The assassination shocked Ecuador, which has already been reeling from sky-high crime rates and the assassination of the mayor of the Ecuadorian town of Manta just a month ago. On Thursday, government representatives stated that 8 Colombians had been arrested for organizing the assassination and that the person who shot Villavicencio was killed in the shootout following the assassination. The government further stated that the suspects had ties with organized crime in Ecuador. Ecuador is in the midst of a presidential campaign to complete the term of President Guillermo Lasso, who dissolved the legislature shortly before he was scheduled to be impeached on corruption charges. The move also triggered a new presidential election in which Lasso is not running for re-election. Joining me now to discuss the latest developments in Ecuador is Joe Emersberger. Joe is a Canadian engineer with Ecuadorian roots who has often written for FAIR and ZNet, among other publications, and also has a new Substack page. Thanks, Joe, for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start with Fernando Vicencio. Who was he, and whose interests and politics did he represent, and what was his presidential campaign about?
Okay, he's a long-time, he's a right-wing candidate. He's a long-time enemy of Correa's government, which was a left-wing government in power from 2007 to 2017. He was briefly, he kind of always had a little bit of officially a flirtation with left-ish movements. Like he was a former trade union person, and he was apparently one of the founders of the political wing of CANAI, the indigenous movements political wing, which is called Pachakutik. And that party has always been to the right of CANAI. It's, for whatever reason, they've always been a disconnect between CANAI's discourse and Pachakutik. So in office, their politicians have always swung to the right. So Villavicencio was involved with that, and he recently he tried to he got elected to Congress in 2021. He was basically allied with Guillermo Lasso, the right-wing president. Now, in fact, he made maneuvers to try to obstruct the impeachment of Lasso, which was underway shortly before the elections were called. So he's basically a right-wing actor, although he's kind of flirted with leftish kind of rhetoric and organization in the past. And he's also his other claim to fame is that he was briefly an author of a hit piece that the Guardian put out about Assange. Julian Assange, claiming that he had met with Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign manager, that he had met with him in the Ecuadorian embassy, which was an absolutely outrageous story. The Guardian ended up just peppering it with weasel words, editing it after the fact to protect themselves from lawsuits. And he was briefly noted his name appeared on the byline of that article for a while. And then he was removed. So he was basically he was that was before he got into into politics again. He was declared himself a journalist, and he was actually convicted under Ecuadorian law. Libel is a criminal offense. So while Correa was in office, he actually got convicted of libel because he and a few other guys they did outrageously libel Correa. They made some outrageous allegations saying that Correa had ordered police to shoot on a hospital. It was outrageous, and he was convicted for that. And so that became kind of another reason he became got some attention internationally, because people rallied behind they objected to the fact that libel was part of the criminal code in Ecuador, so that gained him some notoriety. So his assassination is he was polling like fourth or fifth, very low. He was not a threat to do very well in the election. The election actually, according to the average of the latest polls, before this incident, who knows how this will affect things, but it looked like Luisa Gonzalez, the Correaist candidate, it was poised to, based on an average of polls, like very close to winning outright in the first round. So we'll see what happens, how the vote actually takes place now. With his assassination, Lasso has immediately announced a 60-day state of exception. So that's of concern to me, because although they said, yeah, no way, the elections are going forward, but then how are they going to take advantage of the state of exception to perhaps suppress the vote in certain areas where they think Correa has a large number of supporters? What kind of extra? How could they use these extra powers to tamper with the electoral process? That's a concern I have.
Yeah, that's what I want to get into next. I mean, is basically whose interest do you think Villavicencio's assassination serves? I mean, surely there are those who would like to pin the assassination on the Correa movement or on Correa himself. I imagine because of the the animosity that existed between Villavicencio and Correa. I also find it interesting that there's kind of maybe a bit of a tangent, but I just saw an article that I think it might have been the New York Times that claimed that Villavicencio was charged for insulting the president, not libel, as you point out. So that's a huge difference. But anyway, there was a pretty big animosity in any case, and he was, as you said, imprisoned briefly. So I mean, who do you think might have been behind it, and whose interest does this assassination serve?
Well, I think it's one thing to mention is that the people in charge of Villavicencio's security is the government, the Lasso government. He was one of the candidates who had protection provided by the government as a presidential candidate. They're with common sense, they get official protection from the government. So there were just horrendous error, and his own family has just been absolutely, as you can imagine, livid, denouncing Lasso's government. Say how these errors in the security and the handling of his security were just inexcusable and multiple. Where they let him left the building, the fact that the car wasn't bulletproof, just all sorts of just basic errors in security, and the family's just livid. They wouldn't let him see the body right away. They were denouncing that. So the family's been pointing the finger directly at Lasso, and he's responsible for the security. So yeah, I mean there's already immediately, as soon as this happens, you see right-wing actors, including in my own family, people who support the right are immediately calling for a military government. So there's those kind of reflexive forces are unleashed by something like this. There's this. There's no advantage for Correa. First of all, they don't have they're not in power. They don't have control. Nobody has control of the police apparently. It's just a total free for all right now. I mean, violent crime has gone up quadrupled since 2017, when the right wing basically took power with their Trojan horse Moreno. But it's been just a catastrophe. So I mean, who benefits? I mean, really, the chaos really tends to empower those forces who want to use this as a pretext to seize power. It's what Lasso already tried to do with his referendum. He wanted to roll back. He wanted to extradite. He tried to have a referendum in February that was focused on crime. So the typical solutions the right wing proposed, they created this problem of violent crime, and then their solutions are like give people guns, let this back civil rights, let the government extradite people, and so that seems to be the direction that the right is trying to take this, and trying to blame Correa. I mean, it's outrageous, but they've made outrageous allegations against him before, so they'll feed that kind of discourse will be out there. But for me, honestly, it's hard to say. What my concern is that, like I say, the powers that they've given themselves now with the state of exception, I worry what they could try to pull with that in terms of voter suppression. That kind of maneuver, that's my concern. Like I said, Villavicencio is a minor candidate, so if anything, his votes will probably get transferred to other right-wing candidates. Yeah.
So actually, that would probably benefit the right then. But one of the main issues, as you mentioned, is the skyrocketing crime rate, specifically the homicide rate. And you wrote about this actually last February for an article in Mint Press. How the international media keeps focusing on this issue, and it's been related also, I've seen, to the assassination somehow, that because of these high crime rate, that's has something to do with Villavicencio's assassination. But talk a little bit about what that record, that is, you just mentioned that crime was actually lower during Korea, and why is it become such an issue, and just how serious is it at the moment?
Yeah, it's an absolute catastrophe. I mean, when Correa left office, Ecuador was basically about the second most safe country in Latin America. It had a homicide rate of under 5.8, something like that. Deaths per homicides per 100,000 people, which is about the level of the U.S. and Canada, more or less. Now, it's important, because this always gets distorted in the media. They always say Ecuador was once safe. That's very misleading. Like in the late 70s, early 80s, yeah, it was very safe. I mean, but you're talking 40 years ago. And then from 1980 all the way right through to 2011, to early years of Correa's presidency, the homicide rate is constantly on an upswing. By time Correa, it was maybe about 5-6 in 1980, but by 2011 it had reached like 17, 18, and then under Correa's 10 years in office, it had gone all the way back down to under 6, like about 5.8, under 6. So a reduction of like 2/3, a massive reduction. And that's unprecedented. The whole trajectory over those decades was upward. Was an upward trajectory in the homicide rate. And so Correa had this remarkable achievement of bringing it down by 2/3, and he did it without all the things that the right wing always wants to suggest. Without mass incarceration, without guns proliferating all over without the death penalty, all the kind of things that the right wing people like to propose as solutions. So he achieved that. And then, as soon as Moreno took over and betrayed his movement that got him elected, became basically a right wing government. Immediately, you see the upward trend in homicide starts very, very soon. Pretty much in 2018, 2019, you already see an alarming upward trend. But then under Lasso, it's just gone through the roof. So now, like I mentioned, if it was like 17 or 18 around 2011, when in the early years of Correa's office, when it peaked after a steady climb from the 1980. By 2021, 22, 23, now we're up way beyond that. Now we're up 25, 26. Now it's the highest it's been in decades, like a quadrupling of what it was since 2017. So what the corporate media tends to distorts this history, because the record of the right wing in Ecuador with homicide rate for the last 40 years has always been terrible. It's always been an upward trend when they're in office. They don't have whatever they lack the understanding, and they don't believe in a strong state. They don't believe in funding things properly. They don't believe in they believe in just kind of letting things slide and just letting rich people try to pay for their own security. It doesn't even work for the rich people. It hasn't worked for anybody. Literally nobody is safe in Ecuador. The Correists themselves have had candidates assassinated in recent months as well. It's not something that's just affected any particular side of the political spectrum. It's just a general free-for-all at the moment. You have gangs giving press conferences from the jails. The jails are out of control. Some of the prison massacres are taking place because the criminals have just taken over the prison system. And Luisa Gonzalez, the Correa's candidate, has been hammering at this constantly. Her point is constantly that the criminal elements in Ecuador have basically taken over the state. They've taken over the police, the prisons, parts even of the military. Even the U.S., who was very pro-Lasso, very supportive, there was a U.S. government official who made accusations that from the embassy that there's drug dealers have infiltrated the police and stuff like that. So there's a lot of problems that are just a total catastrophe. And I guess the history tends to get distorted, because you look at the history, the right wing has always been terrible on crime in Ecuador for the past 40 years.
Well, I guess kind of related to that is certainly also the issue of corruption, which was Villavicencio's main issue, and it's also always been portrayed that corruption was particularly bad under Correa, with him being sentenced in absentia while he's living in exile basically in Belgium, and then also his vice president Jorge Glass being imprisoned for corruption under the previous president Lenin Moreno. Now. So what's first of all, what's the record there? I mean, as far as we can tell, of course, corruption is always more difficult to identify than homicide. But I mean, what's your sense of what's happening? And then, of course, Lasso himself was also charged with corruption, and which is one of the reasons we're having this presidential election coming up. So, what's your assessment there in terms of the record?
Well, I mean, under Correa, there was a massive increase in public works. There were all sorts of projects for a huge improvement in the roads and schools built, and hospitals, and infrastructure like anti-flooding infrastructure. 8 hydroelectric plants were built. I mean, there was a huge, massive, really unprecedented investment in infrastructure and public works. So with that, there's always going to be, I mean, it's inevitable that there will be some shenanigans and things going on. And Correa never denied that there were some instances where things happened that this guy was pilfering, this guy was doing this, but it was not at a level that actually impacted the benefits that the macroeconomic benefits that the public received. But it was inevitable as there was going to happen on some level, and that there was going to be used later. It was blown up in a big show by the media, especially under Moreno, to use that as a basis for political persecution, to say, aha, well, Correa's sentence is that he had psychic influence. Like, one of the things he's been accused of, that he had psychic influence over the any lower level official who took a bribe. I mean, if you took that kind of accusation seriously, there isn't a single president anywhere in the world who couldn't be sent to jail, because corruption takes place. There are dirty cops, there are dirty officials, and under any government that ever existed and ever, so you could throw anybody in jail for that. So that's kind of the approach they've taken. And Correa actually has political asylum in Belgium. The cases against him are ridiculous. Interpol is not a leftist organization. They've rejected, on human rights grounds, Ecuador's request to extradite him. I mean, it's a joke. But I mean, like I said, there's like any propaganda. There's some elements of was there corruption under Correa? Yeah, there was some corruption, because there was such a massive investment in public works, and there were, with that comes opportunities for some people to get in there and do some things. But there was no like I said, that corruption was at a low level, that it did not impact the benefits that people receive from those projects. And also, it just doesn't track with a corrupt government that has this unprecedented reduction in homicide rate, that cleaned up the police, that purged the police that instituted polygraph tests for police to make sure that they weren't compromised when they were hired. Would you commit a crime? Have you ever taken a bribe? Questions that put them on the spot right at the beginning before they could even be accepted. So kind of measure. That's not the kind of thing that a corrupt government does. Okay, there could be corruption in the government, but that was not a government that tolerated it or tried. But I mean, did it catch every single instance of corruption? No, I mean, because that just never happens. But I think the right took advantage of that in the early years when Correa was out of office to generate, and the fact that I think that Moreno betrayed Correa generated some confusion, and so that gave those allegations maybe a little bit of credibility early on. But with the catastrophe that they've created, I think for the most part people realize that it was all just a lot of smoke and mirrors meant to just to justify persecution and as an excuse for the right wing to just explain away their own failure. I mean, they're still trying to blame Correa for, like, how can he be responsible for an assassination that takes place 6 years after he's been in power, where they have control of the police? These are the people in power for 6 years now. They have control of the police, the military. It's their military, it's their police. So if candidates are being assassinated and they're providing the security, I mean, it's pretty ridiculous to try to point the finger at a movement that's been in our power for 6 years.
Now, let's just turn to the current presidential election. Um, and this also, of course, again ties into the corruption issue because, as I mentioned earlier, it was one of the reasons why the election was called. But how does it look so far? I mean, who are the front runners and who's running, so to speak? Yeah, basically, who are the main candidates and what are their chances?
Luisa Gonzalez, according to the average of polls, is very close to the 40% point where she could win outright in the first round. Not only she needs 40% plus a 10-point margin of victory over everyone else. It's unclear. Sometimes the second, third place finishers can sometimes be unclear. The polls can be off, but it looked like there's the former vice president under one of the former vice presidents under Moreno. I'll probably mispronounce his name. Everyone refers to him as Otto. And then there's Jaco Perez is in there, a right-wing indigenous leader, and there's a few others, but they're not very consequential. Villavicencio was one of the candidates who's not particularly consequential. So a lot depends. If Luisa Gonzalez can win in the first round, that would be great for Correísmo. If it goes to a second round, things get more complicated for them because then people, instead of these wide dispersion of votes among all these inconsequential candidates, perhaps one candidate can emerge and become more prominent, and become more of a threat to an electoral. And that's setting aside any shenanigans that they pull with the state of exception or with the electoral council that is very clearly biased against Correa. One outrageous ruling that they did in 2021 that they still have is that Correa's image cannot appear in campaign ads. Like his image cannot, so his his image is not allowed to appear in campaign ads. And it's funny because you remember under Correa's government all the fuss that was made about freedom of expression, but that's just an outrageous an outrageous ruling. But they've enforced that and they're doing that for this election as well. So it looks good for Correa, but who knows what now this chaos and the uncertainty of this assassination, we'll have to see what impact that has.
Well, it seems to me that certainly the assassination would make it less likely that Luisa Gonzalez will be able to have that 10% margin because there are fewer, anti-Correa candidates, basically. So then it makes it more difficult for her to have that 10% margin. The other thing, though, of course, is you mentioned Jaco Perez, who's basically running as a leftist candidate, isn't he? Even though you say that he's a right-wing candidate, which has caused quite a bit of confusion, I think, particularly among progressives who want to support one side or the other. What do you make of Perez's chances? Is he a spoiler? And why do you call him a right-wing candidate instead of a progressive, as he's often made out to be?
2021, I know what you mean. That people, he wants to portray himself as an eco-socialist, and some people in North America were taken in by that marketing that he I did a thread on Twitter that went over the just illustrating just how reactionary he is. I mean, he was a strong, very vocal supporter of the 2019 coup in Bolivia. I mean, he welcomed that. He applauded that. Said that was a great thing that happened. He was supportive of the efforts to remove. He says he was hopefully that Maduro would fall as well. He wants Maduro to fall. When Arauz, it is really reactionary stuff. Like Arauz had a proposal in 2021 to stimulate the economy. I'm sorry.
Right, who's Arauz?
The vice presidential candidate in this election. He was the presidential candidate in 2021. Now, Arauz had a proposal to give a $1,000 bonus to all Ecuadorian citizens. I believe it was all directed to the female heads of households as a way to stimulate the economy during the pandemic. And Jaco Perez in the debate said something. Said what he said was that was a bad idea because the poor people have never seen that kind of money before, and they just spend it on beer. I mean, it's just the kind of ignorant statement that you get maybe from a Trump supporter. That just and he was always just basically, when it came to criticizing Korea for years, he was always basically just echoed the right-wing talking points. There's too much public spending. This is all just a waste of money. I mean, so he was there's too many taxes. I mean, he echoes the whole right-wing talking points, but then he adds some kind of environmental claims. He's against mining, claims he's against so he puts an environmental spin on some of his positions, but he's ultimately just a very reactionary person, and he openly relished the fact that the role he played in 2021, and that the indigenous movement calling for a null vote, calling for abstention in 2021. He was on Twitter openly celebrating the fact that cost the Correas, the candidate, and put Lasso in office. And in fact, in 2017, he openly endorsed Lasso, the very right-wing candidate. So just over and over again, he's shown what he's about. But sometimes people don't. They believe they own his own spin, or the spin that other people put on his views, and they try to portray him as a left-wing candidate when he's obviously not.
Well, the election's coming up very soon on August 20th, and we'll see then what happens. Hopefully everything goes well, considering that we've got this state of emergency that Lasso just called. But we'll definitely check in again on the state of things, and we'll leave it there for now. I was speaking to Joe Emersberger, a Canadian engineer who regularly writes on Latin American issues, particularly for his new website, new Substack page. Thanks again,
Greg.
Joe, for having joined me today.
Thanks, Greg.
And thank you, our audience, for joining The World on Fire. Until next time.